Please.
Thank you, Barton. In order to complete a 100-year anniversary, they have to bring somebody out of the past. I retired 28 years ago, and I'm reminded that a minister was going to speak at a large gathering, and there were a lot of things on the program. When he stood up, he said, "You know, a lot of people came by and gave me some words of advice. Most of them said, 'I hope what you have to say will be good and it won't last over 10 minutes.' Another one came along and said, 'If it isn't good, it shouldn't last over 10 minutes.'" We're here to celebrate and think about 100 years. In the beginning, Windermere Union Church was organized in 1916 by 11 people signing a charter, pledging that there was a need in the community for some kind of faith. They met in a schoolhouse. Last winter, that schoolhouse was refurbished and dedicated in Windermere as kind of a memorial. It was 14 by 18. There were no pews. People sat on orange crates. There were no tabletop computers, simply slates and chalk. Well, we've come a long way in building since that time. On the other hand, we're reminded that there is an ingredient that is important, that is beyond buildings, beyond stained glass, beyond statements and authorities from the past that have attempted to define faith. Those who met in Windermere some 100 years ago came from different backgrounds, mostly mainline churches, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, disciples, and each one came with a slightly different perception of faith. And if you have considered faith over the years, you have recognized the reality that faith is indeed subjective, different interpretations and different perception. The wonderful thing about Windermere Union Church was it was open to different understandings. And over the years, they identified with the Florida Congregational Conference for the calling of ministers and missionary work. That became later the part of the United Church of Christ. And in the beginning years, people from Windermere would attend some of those meetings, and the query was often made, were you C, E, or R? Were you congregational, Christian, evangelical, or evangelisch in some cases, or Reformed? And most of the people in Windermere would answer, as many others would, none of the above. We were already a uniting church. We had already reached the point where faith was subjective and different interpretations were open. Reverend John Ishii was a minister here, the first full-time minister, although he was on a part-time basis. He was disabled from World War I, and he came to the community and took up a ministry here in 1932. I have before me his original notebook, which is probably over 100 years old. And at some point in time, I'll leave it to the congregation. It was left to me by his nephew. Reverend Ishii suggested to me how we look on life and how we look on faith. He said when he came here to Windermere, there were 12 people that were awaiting baptism. 6 of them wanted to be immersed and 6 of them wanted to be sprinkled. In keeping with their understanding, they walked down the street to Lake Down and immersed 6 people. Came back to the congregation that was meeting then in the first building and sprinkled 6. Now, Reverend Rishi said over the years, and he spent some 20 years in Windermere following that, he said, I followed the lives of those 12 people, and I couldn't see that it really made any difference whether they were sprinkled or immersed. The more one studies faith, and the more one studies faith in kind of a gathered community, the more you recognize that there are important issues in faith far beyond statements, far beyond practices, far beyond buildings, even beyond stained glass. Faith is tested, it evolved. But something happened in the life of Windermere Union Church, and it spilled over into the community. In effect, something was happening in the life of the congregation and in the community beyond. It was a different world then. Those people who signed that declaration of faith were all born in the 19th century. Their descendants have lived into the 21st century, and now we are looking to a post-millennial generation of young people that are personified by the preschool building behind us. Out of those lives, there will be a continuation of faith. Something happens in faith. Look at the world in 1916. It was a different world. When my mother and her sisters were 21, they couldn't vote. Slavery had ended some 50 years before, but segregation was still a painful image in the life of our community. It wasn't just black and white. If you were Jewish and looking for a hotel, you knew not to stop at one that said restricted underneath the name. There were many different things that happened. Things that happened because people of faith began to exert an influence on the community. Something was happening in the community. Something was happening in life. Many of the people to whom I try to relate faith today are agnostic, and perhaps the best evidence that I can offer to them is not a statement or a building or a practice or a symbol, but simply the reality that something is happening in the life of the world. Something is happening to bring about a constructive change. How many of us would want to go back to life in 1916? A life of segregation, a life without women's suffrage, a life where people of my age were dependent totally on their children to take care of them in their ancient years. Many things have happened in the world, and I suggest to you that they've happened because people of faith were concerned about what was happening in the world, and they demonstrated their faith by changing things in the world. If we take the most ancient statement of faith in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's probably in the Shema. And the caveat to the Shema is, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, and thy neighbor as thyself. Faith is not so much writing statements or building buildings or adopting practices, but it is about the relationship that humanity has with one another. To that extent, something was happening in this congregation that spilled over into the community. Faith evolves. It is not fixed, it is not absolute, it is dynamic, and it is changing. We reflect and consider those things that happened in the life of this community as a result, perhaps, of the faith community that was organized 100 years ago. I suggest that we are inheritors of that faith. We have a responsibility to continue to share that faith. Our acknowledgement is not necessarily to something above that we cannot see or touch or feel, but rather to humanity itself. Within the realm of humanity, we have a responsibility and an accountability to take seriously that call to remember and to love neighbor as well as self. I suggest to you that there were two people born about the same time as those who signed the Declaration of Faith. One lived in Europe, one came from Europe to this country. Albert Schweitzer left a life, a dedicated life, an accepted life, a life that was acclaimed in Europe because his faith community said to him, in effect, life is sacred and should be reverenced. And so he gave himself over, not just to one person, but to turn his life completely over to carrying a message of hope to people in darkness in a land in Africa. Albert Einstein left a message for us that we need to take to heart today. He left his faith community and moved into a life of science. And as a result of his understanding and his explorations, we have the knowledge that life indeed is sacred. Life is a form of energy, and energy cannot be created nor can it be destroyed. But we have the responsibility for life and for that energy. He left these words to us, and I suggest that they are words that we consider as we move from 100 years toward 200 years in the life of this congregation. Einstein suggested that we should remember the past. We do remember and honor the lives of those who went before us, who made it possible for us to live in a community of faith. He suggested that we should not only remember the past, but we live in the future, and we recognize that we have a responsibility to life, and that life is being lived right now, and we are responsible for it. And then he suggested that we should hope for the future. And we look again back toward the preschool building, for we recognize that that post-millennial generation is coming along behind us. And it is our responsibility to help them find their way in a faith community. But the last caveat that he gave to us was never stop asking questions. Faith is never absolute. We are called on to continually question, to seek answers, to find a better way in life. To that end, Windermere Union Church was called into being. To that end, it has served for 100 years, and before us, we don't know how many years, but at least there are limited years and limitless opportunities for those of us who are gathered here to take responsibility for continuing a faith community to the life beyond our own. I don't know if you're a member of this congregation or if you're a visitor, but wherever you are and wherever you're from, you're enjoying the benefits of the gift of life, and as one of those recipients, you have a responsibility. Would you pause just for a moment and reflect upon your responsibility and your contribution to the life of faith that is before us? Pause for a moment as we reflect silently. You may want to realize that you're not alone and reach out and touch the hand of someone near you. Reflect for a moment in silence as we realize that we are called on to continually evolve in our faith. Grateful we are for those from the past, for the opportunities of the present, and for the hope for the future. Take the lives of these here who are gathered this morning and help us to move forward in faith for another 100 years. So be it. Amen.